It's the How Games Make Money podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Grubb from GamesBeat.com. This is the show where we talk to people working in and around games and ask them, how does this business work? Is it all just loot boxes? New episodes come out each Monday. On this episode, I'm talking to ModernVintageGamer, or MVG. He's a YouTuber and game developer who works with Limited Run Games and Night Dive Studios. And we talk about that weird amalgamation of job titles. But I also speak to MVG about homebrew and how security has shaped gaming since the NES. It's a really good conversation. We'll get to all of that in just a second. But first, thank you for listening. You can get more from me at GamesBeat.com. Email the podcast at jeff.grubb@gmail.com with the subject line, How Games Make Money. Or reach out on Twitter. I'm at Jeff Grubb. The podcast is at HGMM Show. I'm also deciding to go ahead with the Patreon that I talked about last episode. My plan is to potentially offer episodes early, but that might be too much work. I'll have to weigh that. I do kind of all of this by myself, so it is a lot of work. But I definitely plan to do patron exclusive episodes where I talk to you guys, I give you guys my thoughts, my insights on what's happening, answer questions. But I also want to give access to a community Discord. I have a couple that I'm already running. I might use one of those, but I also might use the GamesBeat Discord. I'll have to talk to GamesBeat about that and see what they think. But yeah, I'm going to start out with a small goal of just getting 20 patrons. If we can hit that, I'll be thrilled, and it'll make it really easy to continue doing the show. Okay, with that all out of the way, let's get to MVG. All right, and joining me now is MVG. Go ahead and say hi to all the good people out there.
What's going on, everyone? Thanks for having me on, Jeff. It's awesome to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm excited to have you on. You are a less conventional guest than I usually have. I want to just kind of talk about a bunch of different topics with you. Normally I have someone on and I just talk about their job, and we'll do that. And I guess, we should start there. What do you tell people your job is? Because you have a few, right?
Oh my God, man, that's a hard question. I do all sorts of things. I always like to dabble in different things, but as someone who has a game development background, I work in the games industry, but I also am a full-time YouTuber as well. So I'm kind of juggling both of those things at the same time. And sometimes, they kind of co-mingle with each other because I do videos on development topics and interesting stuff about, how things work from a development side of the house. But, it's also a very interesting kind of, cross spectrum of work that I do across those two industries, I guess.
And I guess just for my own curiosity, how long have you been doing it? It seems like you've been in this in the development side for a long time. And then when did you start doing YouTube?
Yeah, so development, I mean, I've been working as a dev pretty much since I graduated from college, but I was not necessarily in game development. I recently got into that probably in the last 12 months, from a professional aspect. I mean, before that, I was doing homebrew stuff on different consoles. But yeah, I mean, I've been writing code since the 90s. And, the YouTube stuff really kicked off, even though I rolled the channel back in 2007, which was a long time ago. I only got serious about it maybe in 2015, 2016, when, I got monetized. And I thought, well, maybe there's a chance here that I can actually, make a little bit of money doing this rather than just, not making anything on the platform. So I kind of, did that as well. And that's obviously grown into something a lot bigger now where it's become a lot more professional, and it's, it's part of my, my work, right? I mean, that's what I do as well, week in, week out to, to make money to, to feed the family and all that stuff. So yeah, I mean, both of those things are a big part of, what I do.
Yeah, and so this is why I'm happy to have you on, because I feel like we can go in any one of a number of directions. But let's actually start kind of in the past. Let's start with the homebrew stuff, because I think you have a lot of experience with this sort of thing. And I guess let's start with you personally. Was it ever a money making venture, or was it always a hobby until it became the YouTube thing?
It was always a hobby. So for me, I've always been that. I was always that kid, right, that was growing up that wanted to know how things worked. So, when I was 8 years old, I took apart a radio to figure out how it all worked, and I couldn't put it back together, of course, because you never know how to do that. But So I've always had that analytical mind about, well, how do things work? You know, like if I watch a video game, even today, you know, like I'm playing Ghost of Tsushima, and I just look at some of the effects and think, man, how does that stuff work? And I've always been curious about how things work. So, you know, the homebrew stuff was really, it wasn't for money at all. I mean, it was really about, I wanted to play Super Nintendo games on my original Xbox, and I had the skills to do it because, like I said, I come from a software development background. So I thought, well, I can do this myself and give this a go and see how it works. So it was always passion projects. You know, there was really never any money involved. And, you know, I mean, look, there are some projects I did along the way where maybe someone would donate $1,000 or give me some money as encouragement. But I mean, it was never anything that was, you know, work.
So, I mean, I guess through that time, then, were you were making money as like a day job as a software developer, and this was the stuff you'd go home at night, take apart the Xbox, and try to figure out how to get the emulators running on there? Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I think it's, you know, it's an escape from your 9-to-5 kind of hustle, right? So you're doing some cool stuff that you really gets you excited about, you know, consoles and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it was absolutely a side hustle, I guess you'd call it.
And obviously, that stuff is now giving you a backbone where you are using this vast library of knowledge you have in your head about how this stuff works to create content for YouTube. Yep. And does it help in the development job now as well, like with limited run games or whatever? Yeah, I mean, you know, I've done sort of some videos that talk about emulation techniques. So, for example, with LRG, I'm working on one of the up-and-coming projects, which is Shantae, that Way Forward will be bringing out. I think it's in September. So, you know, some of the videos that I've done actually talk about some interesting emulation ideas about like how save states work, and how, you know, that rewind functionality where you hold down a button and it kind of rewinds the game in real time for you. So things like that, you know, there's definitely that cross, you know, pollination of topics. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, for me, YouTube is interesting because I don't just focus on one thing. You know, I don't talk about just, you know, current video games or old retro games. I kind of mix it up in a way that just makes it kind of interesting to me, and hopefully, you know, the viewers get some enjoyment out of it, which there seems like they are. Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely one of them. I'm always excited when you cover a topic. You do it really well. I think in particular, I'm always interested when you talk about the security measures on consoles, and when I was kind of looking back recently, and I think there's another podcast, like American Invention Stories or something like that, and they were talking about how after the big crash in '83, Nintendo came along, and one of the key features that like people don't really, you know, as a gamer you weren't really thinking about, but it was really important, was the security on the NES, so that Nintendo could control who was putting games out, so they could limit the amount of software on shelves and have some sort of quality control. And as you're like looking into how security works, do you see that the sort of like how it like has defined the way gaming has existed since this moment in 1985 or whatever? Yeah, I think so. I mean, you look at video game companies and publishers, they really take this stuff a lot more seriously than they used to. And there's been a lot of, I'll say, failures along the way. But I think now in the last maybe 5 years or so, I mean, ever since, you know, the current generation of consoles like the Xbox One and the PS4 and the Switch, even though the Switch was easily dispatched security-wise, probably about 3 weeks after it came out. But cryptography is such an important part of any kind of system these days, where it's almost unbreakable to get in. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely been a lot of push from not only from software but also from hardware to get their systems secured as best they can. And of course, you know, things like games as a service, where you're always connecting to
to some server somewhere. Otherwise, you don't have the experience that you would normally get, right? So, if you can't hook into that server, then you can't play the game because there's content on the other side kind of waiting for you to use. Those types of things as well have really become a lot more front and center in video games, as we know. So, yeah, I mean, I think the original days of Nintendo with the security lockout chips that they brought out kind of set the path for most developers, publishers, hardware manufacturers to really sit down and take notice that we can't really be having these bootlegs of hardware coming out because it's just going to really hurt our business. And to Nintendo's credit, I mean they've had their ups and downs security wise, especially kind of in the early 2000s, but they've done a lot of work to get where they are. And I know that, the Switch was a bit of a misstep for them, but they've also very quick to correct their mistakes as well. So, I mean, I think as time goes by, we're just going to see security just become so much more, important. And it already is, but there's also going to be just a lot more focused on it. And I think systems are going to get a lot more secure as well. I mean, we haven't really heard any stories about the PS4 and the Xbox One getting hacked because normally when there is an exploit that's found, it's usually patched pretty quickly and in real time. So security now is a lot more important than it used to be back in the old days.
Yeah, and it does seem like it's this sort of shadow design element to like the way you described always online games, and those things are rising in popularity in part because people actually do like those kinds of games more a lot of times, or at least the people that like those games tend to spend more money. And so we get a lot of online multiplayer games that require a connection to a server. But also, the incentive is there for developers to figure this stuff out, right? Because those things are inherently more secure because they control the content on their side and you just can't get to it. It's also probably why I think Google thinks Stadia might be so appealing to people, at least developers, because it's all on their servers. It's impossible to hack. At least it's not impossible, but almost impossible to hack. So,
right.
You could see how this desire to control the experience and control the delivery mechanisms is shaping the way that we get games. Yeah. And it's just going to be more of that going forward, right?
Yeah, man. I mean, you touched on it there. They control it, and look, even if there was some kind of entry point into Stadia, because they literally control the hardware on their end, then they can just, they can patch it pretty much immediately. So, yeah, I mean, I think that aspect is something that we're going to continue to see. And of course, Game Pass and xCloud and all that stuff is really going to be something that becomes a lot more focused, over the next generation.
In terms of the homebrew scenes going forward, what is the what's the health of that? Is there still as much happening now as it was happening back when you were in the heyday of the Xbox?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've been kind of keeping an eye on the Nintendo Switch scene, and yeah, I mean, the scene seems to be just thriving. I mean, it's never really gone away. Even though, like I said, that the PS4 and the Xbox One don't really have the same level of commitment from a homebrew capacity because, those systems, I mean, there are ways to run homebrew on a PS4. The Xbox One, there's the developer mode. So Microsoft kind of just took that out of the equation, which I think is interesting that they did that, because they offer that $20 development mode where you basically just pay your money and you have access to the hardware, so you can write your own homebrew, albeit from a legal standpoint. So, I think that's interesting that Microsoft decided they would do that and ultimately just kind of, stop from piracy and stop from hacking the system. But I mean, going back to the Switch, yeah, there's a lot out there, and it's interesting that we see, these remasters and remakes of games, coming out. So, for example, I mean, one that comes to mind this year was we saw Doom 64 come out earlier this year, but I know that there's already been homebrew versions of Doom 64 and Doom 3. They've been out for about 2 years now. So there's always going to be that homebrew alternative that costs you pretty much nothing other than some time trying to figure out where to download this stuff from, and hopefully you can find a copy of your game to get your data files from. And, you have I don't want to say the exact same experience because, you lose things like networking and matchmaking and all that stuff. Usually the homebrew equivalents are single player experiences because, connecting to a server while you're running on a modified Nintendo Switch, for example, it's probably not the smartest thing to do. You'll probably get your console banned pretty quickly. But I think that scene is still very much active and alive, and it's one of those things you don't really hear about unless there's some big announcement or someone comes up with some amazing piece of homebrew that that people just kind of completely in awe of. So it's always there, and there's definitely forums that you can check out to see what's going on. But yeah, I mean, the scene is active and ongoing, and I think it's going to continue. I mean, I think when the next generation of systems come out, we'll see a push to see if we can get homebrew and unsigned code running on those environments as well. I don't know if it's going to get anywhere, but it's certainly not going to stop people from trying to break into the system.
Yeah, you're the point there about Microsoft adding the developer mode. It's like I kind of forgot about that. That is kind of where a lot of that stuff went, and we even saw stuff. I think like I can't remember if it was RetroArch or something similar, but it ended up on like the Microsoft Store, and you could add it and then install it on an Xbox. And I don't know if it ever actually got fully up and running, but I know like it was like right there, and it's like you could almost see Microsoft thinking about why are we trying to stop this stuff? We should just try to funnel it into our store where we can have control of it, so people like want to put their effort there. They see the potential to make money, and then if there's something legally shady, we can sort of just stop it at that point. Do you expect more of that, or is that just too much of a headache for a company like Microsoft or Sony?
It's a good question, Jeff. I mean, if you look back in history and think about the PlayStation and the Xbox, right? I mean, the original Xbox got hacked pretty much in the first couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. And although Microsoft was not happy about it, Bill Gates was quoted as saying, we need to tap into these people and figure out, how they're doing all this really cool stuff. We need to give them a platform to make some cool ideas. And if you look at the Xbox 360, they came up with the XNA stuff they did for a while, which sadly they took away. And over on the PlayStation side, Linux ran on the PS2, so there was always that ability to write code on a console and kind of hack around and write some programs or write some games. And obviously on the PS3, there was Linux that ran on there as well, which was very famously taken away, which resulted in class action lawsuits and what have you. But
I think I bought a drink with my my check.
Oh, you got a check? Oh, awesome! Good for you. I never got a check. I'm still salty about it, but I think these big hardware companies, they've always wanted to give people some freedom, but in a sandbox, like in a kind of real tightly knit sandbox. And I think, the developer mode is just kind of the next iteration of that. And even though I did hear about RetroArch as well, I think ultimately Microsoft has the final say, because from what I understand, I don't know if it actually ever got onto their Microsoft App Store. You had to kind of sideload it if you had a developer enabled Xbox. So it was kind of sneaking the program in. So I don't know if they actually ever approved that going onto their App Store. Right. I could be wrong about that, of course, but that was kind of my understanding. But I think hardware manufacturers, Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo, they've always wanted to allow people to write games on their systems, but it's very much they just take very small baby steps. Like I would expect developer mode to be on the Xbox Series X. I think that initiative would probably continue. Sony, on the other hand, haven't really done anything for a while, like I said, since the PS3. But there's always other incentives to get to write games on consoles. There's obviously the independent developer option as well, and on the Switch, for example, there's pretty cheap and easy ways to become a registered Nintendo developer and become an indie developer. So I think these companies, they're trying different things. I think right now Microsoft has the edge on both Sony and Nintendo. I think Sony's gone back to their old ways of it's just about games. We don't care about anything else. Which, look, it's worked for them for a long time. I'm definitely not knocking them, but I think, Microsoft has always been a little more open to letting people experiment with their hardware.
You've established your YouTube channel. You have this presence as an expert on a lot of these matters, and now you're kind of getting into game development. I guess, how did that first start? Like, when people come to talk to you about this sort of thing, like, what kind of help are they looking for?
Yeah, so the way it got started actually was with my homebrew work. So it all went down about 2 years ago when I got a Switch. I was messing around with it, and I got it modded pretty quickly, and there was a homebrew development kit that you could download, it's 100% completely legal, contains no proprietary Nintendo code. And I was just kind of messing around with it, seeing what I could do with it. And I remember one particular day, I stumbled across the reverse engineering source code of Diablo, which is one of my favorite games growing up on the PC. So I was like, wow, I'm going to see if I can port this to the Switch. And I ended up getting it on the Switch in about a week and a half, 2 weeks. I had it up and running. And I remember Kotaku picked up, so I made a video on it, and then Kotaku saw my video and they picked up the story, and they kind of ran the story on their website. So it was really the homebrew stuff that got me recognized, by both Limited Run Games and Night Dive Studios. It wasn't until much later when they reached out and asked, hey, would you be interested in helping out with some development work that we have, with their different, in the respective companies. But yeah, that was kind of what kind of kickstarted it all. And for me, that was really, really cool, because I always wanted Jeff to get into the industry, but I never really knew kind of the right path to take, because, what is the path into the games industry? Like, do you go to college and graduate? Well, I did that, right? But I did that in computer science, but I did that and I just kind of worked regular kind of IT jobs, writing business software. So, I never really knew where to start as far as getting into game dev, and I didn't really have the appropriate connections. So, YouTube and the Diablo port on the Switch was really what got me recognized. And, it was something that I was very flattered, to be asked, because even though I've got like 25 plus years of writing software experience, I've never written games before. So, this was a whole new ballpark for me, and it's been a fun ride so far, for sure.
When I'm watching your videos, it feels like you must have been making games for forever, because just like the way you break down how I think I was thinking of this when I was watching your video on like how Game Boy graphics works, and then right. Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance, and I'm like, this is incredible. I'm like listening to it with my YouTube Premium account, and I'm like, it's in my pocket. I'm like, well, I got to get the video out and actually watch this, because there's so many cool things happening on the screen as well. But I'm like, this is so intricate, and he seems to have a full grasp on how all these things work. Is that stuff you picked up as part of your hobby? Picked up recently just because you're interested in making these videos, or is this stuff that you've known for a long time and just by happenstance? Like, how do you acquire all this knowledge?
Most of it I've known for a long time, and for me, I never really know what's going to connect with my audience. I mean, I have a fair idea what I think is going to do well, but I don't know. And I think if you ask any YouTuber out there what they think is going to be, a hit video, their next video, I think they'd be lying, because there's always that uncertainty about, is this something that, is going to connect with my fans and my audience. So the Game Boy stuff, yeah, I've known about for years, right? I mean, I've known about that pretty much since I was dabbling with emulation, back in like 2001, 2002. So I just felt like, it's interesting to tell these stories about old hardware, because, you think about the Game Boy, and you think, wow, that was a cool system. I loved the Game Boy, but man, it was so limited. It only had 4 colors, and it wasn't really that great. That the sound was kind of tinny and everything. But if you look closer, if you kind of literally take the cover off and dig into that hardware, it's quite sophisticated and quite technically advanced, even though they use really simple off the shelf, pieces to make that system work. And I think, for me, that's really what's fascinating about consoles and hardware, and not just the old stuff, even the new stuff, but the old stuff, for me is what I really get into, because I think every system has an interesting story to tell. If you kind of look underneath, you can see what was going on in the mindset of the people that were making these systems at the time. And, the Game Boy, for example, it just has 4 colors, but man, you could do so much with those 4 colors. I mean, you could do these amazing effects, and even, Dylan Cuthbert was getting 3D games running on a 1 megahertz, Game Boy, with 4 colors. I mean, some of the things that developers were doing on this stuff was absolutely mind blowing. And I really just wanted to illustrate, how great the hardware was, even though it was very limited.
Yeah, I think I find myself drawn to this stuff right now because modern hardware is great. There's a lot of cool stuff happening. I'm as interested as anyone in ray tracing and how AMD is going to approach ray tracing compared to NVIDIA. But there was a lot more of that diversion in how you would approach making games back then. Consoles were very different. There wasn't just a one size fit all approach, and so going back and actually learning the details of how those different systems worked in different ways, it's really fascinating. And it's also okay, this is how people develop their taste over time, because they were playing primarily on one console or another, and so you had the PlayStation was so much better at running games faster, and maybe that's why you have a certain taste going forward or whatever. Yeah. But now it's if one of the systems can run it, you could even eventually get it running on the Switch if you just turn down the settings far enough.
Yeah.
I guess the question here would be do you find modern hardware as interesting? Not
really. I mean, I hate to be a downer, but it's all kind of x86 based, and it's all kind of the same architecture. I think the last major deviation was the cell processor on the PS3, but even that, right? It was PowerPC, and the 360 had a very, very similar PowerPC Xenon processor, but the cell was something completely different. I think for me, that was probably the last major kind of diversion in hardware, between systems. Now, obviously, the Switch, they do their own thing. Yes. with ARM, the Tegra X1, with ARM. But yeah, I mean, both Sony and Xbox and Microsoft, they've been pretty much just sitting on the same architecture, since 2013, which it's a little unfortunate for me, and it does take a lot of that excitement and mystery out of those systems. But there's always cool things about the new hardware as well that I think is interesting. But yeah, I mean, the older stuff is why I like it so much, because every system, every console that came out had something unique and interesting about it, and and I think it all started, like you said, from the days of the NES and the Game Boy. I mean, they kind of were the pioneers of interesting, and really awesome, hardware in their systems,
I can look at the picture of the PS5 when they first announced it and kind of stare at it for a little bit, and you're like, okay, I think I understand exactly what's happening here, why they built it this way, and just knowing the specs, okay, they're dealing with a lot of heat. It's it's very it's predictable, and I do think this kind of can come across as oh, we're bummed out about next gen systems, and it's not necessarily that. It's just that going back and finding the ways that these older systems worked so differently was just and the way that developers found their ways around the limitations was always so exciting. And every time I hear a new story about that stuff, it's man, people are so creative and so smart, and they squeeze the most out of these things way beyond what anyone ever expected. When the Game Boy came out in 1989 or whatever, no one was expecting some of the things that would eventually happen there. And it's just kind of here. I think we know what to expect, and so it is a little bit less exciting.
Yeah, for sure. And I think if you ask me what my favorite system right now is, it's the Switch, because I mean the Switch is a great system, in its own right. There's so much good about it, but hardware-wise, it's a complete departure from the Wii U, and obviously from Sony and Microsoft. So having that kind of Tegra X1, even though it's been basically cut in half as far as clock speed, is an interesting way to make a system. But I think there's been a lot of really good and quite impressive ports that have come out for that system, and as developers get more, up to date and to grips with the APIs and how things work, I think we're going to see more of those things. I mean, for me right now, the Switch has been the one that's kind of impressed me the most. I mean, with ports like The Witcher 3, obviously, and Doom 2016, and obviously Doom Eternal that's coming. I mean, those types of things have been, very interesting and unique development that's been happening as well. So for me, I'm probably going to be talking about those on a video in about 7 or 8 years from now, how The Witcher 3 was done on the Switch, and stuff like that. Because I definitely think the Switch has some interesting, stories to tell.
I think people that play those games on those systems now and haven't played it anywhere else are going to have really fond memories of the way those games look. Just the crunch down version. It's got a lot of character, and it's of course it's not the ideal way to play these things, but it does have a lot of character. I mean, your point about the Switch being very interesting right now, as far as like all the consoles available on the market at the moment, absolutely, because it does feel like it's more future-proof in a way, just because it does feel like we are eventually going to be moving towards an ARM-based future. x86 isn't going to go anywhere, but it does feel like, we see Apple switching to ARM, and I doubt that they're going to be the last ones kind of like thinking about that way as the future of their hardware platforms. And so Nintendo already being in a position to sort of take advantage of this, of a RISC style chip. It could keep them like really competitive as Sony and Microsoft start looking around and being like, okay, we've sort of stretched x86 as far as we can on a home platform. What are we going to do next? And they might be stuck a little bit when they have to like figure out that transition, and Nintendo won't have to. So I don't know. I'm excited for the Switch, for the Switch's future. I'm also excited to see what Nintendo does next. Is there any doubt in your mind that they stick with like the Switch style thing going forward? Because to me, I'm like, this is a guarantee. They're just going to do something more like this next time.
There's no doubt in my mind at all. I think whatever comes next, and look, whatever comes next could be a while away, right? I mean,
yeah, I agree.
We keep hearing 2022 maybe, but really, I mean, it could be 5 years, right? Since we see a new Switch system or a successor to the Switch. But yeah, I think they'll stick with a very similar design than what they have. I mean, it's printing money for them right now. Let's be honest. Both the hardware and the software. So yeah, I mean, why would you deviate away from that? They finally struck gold. After the Wii U was such a failure. So, and there was so many questions whether they would actually be able to recover after the Wii U. But I mean, man, have they recovered or what? I mean, they've just come out and absolutely killed it. So yeah, I would say whatever comes next will just be a more powerful iteration of the Switch. But I don't necessarily think it's going to be like super computer powerful, right? I mean, I think they don't want to lose track of what's made the Switch so great. And, you got to take into account heat and thermals and battery life and all that stuff. So whatever comes next will be, I'll say, a shot in the arm, or maybe a 25 to 30% increase in performance. I think, from a technical standpoint, the memory clock speed is probably the biggest bottleneck that they have. And if that's something that they decide that they, want to boost, I mean, even that alone would help many games, run a little better. So yeah, I mean, stick with what's working for you. I think that's what they need to do, and I think that's what they'll do.
My dream there is that they go with an SSD for their storage solution. I think that would be pretty expensive, but I mean, there's an SSD in iPhones. They could maybe find a way to do a relatively small size, but still keep it pretty fast. And I think that would be a big boost to the way that whole thing worked. And I mean, your point about the thermals and the battery life. I think that they've been very smart to sort of like when they got that extra processing power, when they did the revision of the Switch original, and they didn't use that to boost the clocks or anything, and then they didn't use it to increase power. They just used it to increase battery life. They're in a really strong position to, if they do decide to increase power, they're going to be able to get a lot more without sacrificing battery life, because these chips have come a long way since this system came out. And the Tegra was actually a couple years old when the Switch launched. So there's a lot of power overhead there that they can tap into, and then still kind of maybe also increase battery life at the same time. And people are going to be expecting kind of what they've been getting on the Switch. They're still not going to be expecting like full 4K. So I think Nintendo's done a really good job at positioning this whole platform for the future, and it's got me excited to see what they're going to do next.
Yeah, and if you ask any developer what they want in the next Switch. SSD, you know, is something important. Having that super fast loading obviously is very helpful, but I think the biggest bottleneck right now is RAM. You know, 4 gigabytes, and you only have 3.2 available. You know, any developer that's working on the Switch knows the pain of having that limited. I mean, that sounds a little crazy that you've got 4 gigabytes, and you know why would you run into issues? But I mean, if you look at any kind of postmortem of any big game that's come out on the Switch and listen to, you know, developers talking about what was the biggest pain point, it's usually around, you know, memory restrictions.
That makes a ton of sense. I do remember I talked to I can't remember the developer that did the Witcher ports, slipping my mind. Saber Interactive, I think.
Saber Interactive,
Saber did it, and and they mentioned that was like, they're like, oh yeah, we got it running, and it's like once we had to crunch it down to fit into that memory, it was we lost a lot there, and we had to go back and rethink about how we were going to do this entire game. So they figured it out though, but yeah, it'd be nice to have that extra space for sure. MVG, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Well, hey, thanks for having me on, Jeff. I know we usually have you on the Nate the Hate show, and I know you've been on the Spawncast a few times, so it's good to turn the microphone the other way and you know, ask me questions for a change. It's been fun, man.
I really enjoyed that. Absolutely. You mentioned it, you know, Spawncast, Nate the Hate show. Those are a couple things that you're on regularly. Anything else that you want to tell people, like where they can find you?
You can find me on Twitter at ModernVintageG. I usually tweet once a day or so. I'm pretty active on there. And obviously my YouTube channel, I usually release a video once a week on some interesting topic. I never know what I'm releasing next, so don't ask, because I'm literally like, and I think that's what makes my content so interesting, is that I just don't have a roadmap of, you know, what's coming. Like I said, does everyone else have that? Because I certainly don't. You know what I mean?
You said, like, if you try to ask a YouTuber, like, what if their next video is going to be popular or whatever, it's the same thing in my job too. Like, I write a story, I have no idea if anyone's going to read it or not. It's impossible to predict. So putting that stuff out there, you just gotta, you have to do what you find interesting and hope other people find it interesting as well. And I think that's what you're doing well, is the stuff you find interesting is actually very interesting. So.
Yeah, man, you gotta have passion for it. If you do it because you think it's going to get a lot of views, but you don't have, you know, it's not inside of you, it's not in your heart, then it's just going to bomb.
Absolutely. And that's a lesson I've learned as well, for sure. All right. Yeah. Thank you to everybody out there for listening. I really appreciate it. I'll be back with another new episode next week. Until then, take care of yourself. Have a good one, and goodbye.